The first reading paints for us a dramatic and pivotal moment in the history of humanity. The Creator of all things visible and invisible had revealed himself in a very personal way to an elderly, wandering shepherd and promised him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. And God never breaks his promise. Well, Abram was overwhelmed with that. It was too good to be true. But in the ancient world, when you would form a contract, there was no written word. But they would go through this process of sacrificing an animal, cutting it in half, and the two members of the contract would walk between the split halves. The implication being that if either one of them broke the contract, the one that broke the contract would be broken like that animal. So he slaughters 3 animals and sacrifices some birds. And then he waits to see what would happen next. And it's daylight, it's sunny, and vultures begin to circle the slaughter. The birds of prey, the raptors, say, "Oh, we have a free meal down there." And they start swooping in and landing on the carcasses. And Abraham, sweaty, old, is beating the vultures away and waiting to see what happens. And then darkness comes. It's night. And then he goes into a trance-like state. And in the midst of the darkness, fire comes sweeping down between the 2 halves of each of those slaughtered animals. And he knew the contract had been signed by God's fire. An interesting thing is he didn't have to walk through the 2 halves. God made the promise. And that promise would not be revoked even if, humanly speaking, Abraham would fail, as all of us would. It would be the promise of God that would not fail. Now, as infants, most of us were claimed in baptism for Christ at that time. And in our purity of that moment, the vultures are far, far away. Others, accepting the Lord and the Lord's church as an adult, has been baptized and cleansed of their sins for that particular moment. But the vultures are always circling, sometimes getting closer and closer to us. And we need the Good Shepherd to beat them off with his staff. Because on our own, strangely enough, we'll invite those vultures to come closer to us. The vulture of pride or arrogance, the vulture of greed, of laziness, of lust, of envy, of jealousy. They're all circling all the time and want to feed off our souls. And it's a spiritual battle that goes on throughout our lives. But it's a battle worth fighting. And it carves us as having an identity that's aligned with the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. An identity that is sealed by the Christ who claims us at our baptism as one of his sheep, as a part of his flock. Now, as a part of his flock, we know we have a sinful nature and many times we sin, but that's why we have the sacrament of reconciliation, of confession, which is so critically important. To say we don't need it is to say we don't have sin. And that in itself is a delusion of pride and arrogance and a pretty deadly sin. Now, many sins are what we call venial sins. They're wrong and they need to be confessed, but some are deadly. And somebody can have a pretty good relationship with God, family, friends, the church, and neighbors, and yet in a single act, a mortal sin, freely and completely do something that's evil. Commit adultery, rob, steal, lie under oath. Any number of ways a single act could disrupt our relationship with God. Now, God's love continues for us, absolutely, doesn't blink. But on our part, we put a barrier between ourselves and the Lord who loves us. Now, generally, these deadly sins don't happen out of the blue. Somebody might be mildly flirtatious with someone they find attractive, and the vulture comes just a little bit closer. And then the person, spends more and more time with that individual that's not his or her spouse. Perfectly innocent up to a point, but the vulture's getting closer and closer until finally the person gives themselves over to an act of adultery, which comes into a family like a nuclear explosion. It's never innocent. It's never harmless. Same it is true of, say, greed and theft. Somebody just takes a little bit from the company's petty cash account, and then something else. We're doing this construction work. They won't notice these couple 2x4s gone that I need to build a doghouse at home. And it builds and builds till finally the person is completely in debt through embezzlement or theft. The company that he's been feeding off of goes bankrupt. Everybody loses their job. It's a deadly sin built up to by a whole sequence of venial sins, inviting that vulture of greed to feed off the human soul and imagination. The vice of laziness. Well, I'll do that tomorrow. But of course, tomorrow never comes. And a person could have a whole lifetime of tomorrows and never actualize their talents, their abilities, their capacity to contribute to their families and society, and be living in a deadly state because they have buried their talents rather than utilize them. On and on it goes. How a single act or a series of acts could kill our relationship with God. God's fire and light is still there, but are we walking in it? Now, there are times where we're not sinning, but we nevertheless enter periods of darkness and doubt and confusion in our spiritual life. And when the darkness came on Abraham, he didn't know where to look. Wherever he looked, he would see darkness. But he came back to the sacrifice. Still it's dark. Then dark, and then dark. But by looking at the sacrifice, he sees the fire of God passing between the carcasses, and he's given the light that he needs. We come back again and again, even filled with doubts or weaknesses, to the sacrifice of all sacrifices, the sacrifice of the Mass. If we do that, whatever darkness we're struggling within our soul at this very moment will eventually be dispelled by the fire and the light of God. Now, in today's second reading, St. Paul's writing to the Philippians, one of the communities he loved the most because they gave him the least headaches. They supported him on his journey by giving him care packages, even though he never asked for them. And so he writes them, he said, but look out for those believers who appear to believe, but they really are using their faith and their religion to feed themselves. Their real God is their belly. Well, I've got a pretty ample belly myself. But they're in religion for the comfort of it, or the prestige of it, or the wealth of it. And they're missing the whole point. So Paul would say, look at my own situation with those of my immediate collaborators and workers. We're broke. We're tired. We earn our own living wherever we can through the work of our own hands. More often than not, we're in prison, or we're beaten, or we're ridiculed and ignored. He said, if you see people like that, you know they are right with God. And be that person yourself. A very powerful message Paul delivered to the Philippians. Now, we know in every era, some people who start out as sincerely religious in their spiritual journey get derailed. They invite that vulture of greed or pride into their life or soul. And as a result, they hurt themselves and many who have placed faith in them. Decades ago, when we first started our television mass, it was at the height of televangelism and also at the height of, unfortunately, scandals that broke out in each of those ministries. Excessive greed or lust entered the picture. So the priest and brothers here said, well, we'll never make an on-air appeal because we want to convey the message and not of ourselves. A noble ideal, and it's worked. We're broke. But it is better to be broke financially and rich spiritually. That's what St. Paul's talking about in today's second reading. Now, when we come to the final reading, the gospel, the apostles are still trying to figure Jesus out. They're looking for the best jobs. Hey, make certain that I've got, the highest place in the kingdom. Yes, they're suffering, but they know this is a down payment on some cushy job later with power, prestige, and influence. But Jesus takes 3 of them aside. They go to the mountaintop to pray. Peter, James, and John. And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appear there. The 3 of them. The apostles are overwhelmed. They see finally the real inner life of Jesus, and the light is dazzling, much like that light of the fire that went through the sacrificed animals in the Abraham story. They don't want to go anywhere else. They don't want to do anything else. They want to stay there forever on that mountaintop. But then, just like Abraham, when darkness enveloped him and the night came, a cloud comes that is dark indeed, and they're frightened. It's like a storm cloud that can kill with lightning, a storm cloud that could beat you down with hail. And out of the darkness, while they're most terrified, they hear a voice with a very simple message. This is my Son on whom my favor rests. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. And the apostles are trembling on the ground. Then, whoosh, the clouds disperse, and Jesus is there alone with them. And they don't tell anybody the story until after the resurrection. But you would think, having experienced that, sin would never enter their lives. Oh no, you'd think after that, they'd be perfect human beings. We say, I certainly, if I had a vision like that, I would be. Well, maybe the first day or two, the first week or two after. But eventually, as we know, Calvary, Peter failed miserably. And even in the Acts of the Apostles, we see him vacillating back and forth, what to do, what not to do in his ministry. And he was the greatest of the apostles. And so there are times in our lives when we're so close to God, we know it's true, and sin is out of the question. But then there are other times when, sin enters the picture. But God's forgiveness is always there. And that's what this Lent is about, and that's what every Lent is about.